So the gospel this morning indicates the beginning of the bread of life discourses that we receive from St. John in his gospel. Jesus says very plainly that he is the bread of life. But it indicates what took place last week. You remember there was a crowd. It said 5,000 men, not including the women and children. So probably, if you figure not including women and children, most of those men were married and would have children. So, you're talking about a crowd of 15,000 people that were fed with what? Do you remember the number? 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But it's how they received those 5 barley loaves and 2 fish that I kind of focus on just for a minute here today. You remember how they received the food that they would eat? Well, there was a lad here that says in the gospel we heard last week. First Jesus says to Philip, you have enough money to pay for food for this crowd. And of course, Philip says, not with 200 days' wages could we feed them and give them even just a little. And then Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, says to him, there's a lad here, there's a boy here who has 5 loaves, 2 fish. But what good is that for so many? It's that boy that I focus on. You know what? That little guy, his mother, more than likely, put the 5 loaves and 2 fish in a knapsack and handed to him and said, you guard this with your life, because this is all we have to eat. And what happens? Jesus is in need. The beauty and the purity of the innocence of children. Jesus is in need. He needs the 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. So what does he do? The little boy says, here, I have this. He gives it to him without thinking because Jesus needs it. He has faith that something good will come of it. And of course, we know the story. The whole crowd ate their fill with 12 wicker baskets left over, and that little guy went home with more than what he started with. That's you and me. We'll go home with more than what we have if we can only give of ourselves. I think that's the kind of the message, And that's what Jesus is basically saying today. We heard, in the book of Exodus how, the people complained, even though they had seen the power and the glory of God in their exodus from Egypt. Now they're in the desert and they're complaining again. Why don't you just leave us slaves in Egypt where we could sit by our flesh pots? They had meat in those pots on a fire, and they had more than enough bread. Here we are starving to death now. Did you bring us out here to die? They complain. Instead of God getting angry, he says to Moses, I will provide. And so in the evening, quail came up and covered the camp where they could take the quail and eat their fill of meat. Then each day, those flakes from those trees, what kind of trees were they, by the way? This is real. They were tamask trees, T-A-M-A-S-K, tamask trees. They exist. And they produce kind of a frost, a flake. And they fall to the ground, and when they evaporate, it becomes a flake. And so he told them, then have the people recover those flakes that are on the floor of the desert. By the way, if they were on the floor of the desert, what was the floor of the desert? What did it consist of? Sand. So here you got tiny flakes that dried up laying on top of sand. You know how painstaking that must have been for them to scrape up the flakes and not get the sand in the way. They must have been eating for 40 years pretty gritty bread. But nonetheless, here's the thing. And what did they do? They were only to recover enough of those flakes to make bread for one day. Why? Well, God was testing them. They would only take what they needed each day. So they depended on God each and every day of their life. That's what you and I are called to do. So he provided the flakes to make bread and the quail for their meat. And then on Friday, of course, they would take a double portion. Why? Well, Saturday was the Sabbath. They couldn't work. So they make double portion of bread so they would have it for the Sabbath. And this is how they lived for 40 years, folks, huh? You and I come here today to dip in the bread of life in God's living word that we heard proclaimed today. And in this wonderful sacrament of Jesus' most sacred body and most precious blood, that which he gave us at the altar of the cross, he would give himself. I am the bread of life. And he proved it by offering himself to his heavenly Father to the point of death, handing over his spirit so that he could be raised up, and with him all those who have faith in him. Isn't that part of the reason why you're here this morning? We have faith in God, in his living word, and in the sacrament of Jesus' most sacred body, most precious blood. But what do we need to have? The same thing as that little boy last week. Faith. Lord, you need it? Here I am. How many of us are willing to do that, though? Huh? Give over everything in a spiritual way, that God in turn may transform us to make us his bread for those around us, that we may see Christ in each other, that we may be Christ for each other. You know, I was over at St. Thomas of Becket, over in, it's beyond Pleasant Hills, because I was at St. Elizabeth of Hungary. Now, that's part of that grouping now, much like we are. Changes names, whatever it might be, but St. Thomas of Becket is a neighboring parish, a part of the grouping over there in Pleasant Hills. And so I went, they had their festival. But I couldn't help but think of St. Thomas of Becket. He was a good friend of who? Henry II, King of England. And Henry II figured, you know, he could have the corner on the market. He would put the right person in charge of the church there. This is now the Roman Catholic Church. This is before Henry VIII. And so he appoints his dear friend Thomas of Becket to become Lord Chancellor of England. What he didn't count on, though, was when Thomas of Becket was ordained to the priesthood and then became the bishop, that his heart was changed. And he devoted himself totally and completely to God and to the church, to the chagrin of Henry II. And so he stood toe-to-toe with the king. But the people loved him, and he's remembered as a great saint within the church. He was a man for all seasons, as the movie and the book says, huh? To the extent that Henry II had him murdered where? In the cathedral, doing what? Confecting the Eucharist at Mass. He loved the Lord so much that nothing or no one would get in his way. My sisters and brothers, that's you and me, to be a man for all seasons, to be like that little boy, to trust in the Lord in all things, huh? That we may be the bread of heaven as well, reflecting the goodness and love of God. So today, as we come to share in God's living bread of the Word and his living bread in the Eucharist, let you and I be transformed to be able to see Christ in each other, to be Christ for each other.